Hello. In the 40 years since its inception, the Warhammer game has gone from simple, lawless black and white booklets to a 500-page tome full of deep lore, rich history, and more special rules than there are words. And that was before the world even ended. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today we're looking at every edition of Warhammer Fantasy. I love the Warhammer world, and for the longest time I didn't play miniatures games in any other setting. Even the 40k universe didn't appeal to me, at least until the Pheromones of the Tau started doing their wondrous work. But it was the Warhammer world and the games set in that place that really excited me. Those were the stories I wanted to tell and be part of. This video covers all 8 editions of Warhammer that have been released over the last 40 years, and if you enjoy it, please feel free to leave a like. But if you want even more detail about how those editions came to be, who designed them and what the context for them was, then you're in luck, because every week this month I am releasing a deep dive that looks at 2 editions at a time. And that's because this month is Big April. I am celebrating 6 months on YouTube and the launch of my Patreon, patreon.com/JordanSorcery. If you want to support me and help the channel grow, get involved in discussions and votes about which games should be the topics for future videos, and get the behind the scenes stuff about how the channel is evolving and changing over time, then feel free to check out the link in the description below. But none of that helps us right now with this history of Warhammer. Well, I don't know if it was a dark and stormy night or not, but I know that the shadow of more definitely came calling. Because in 1978, 2 school friends, Richard Halliwell and Rick Priestley, released a wargame called Reaper. It was a single black and white volume and provided a set of rules for playing small-scale fantasy engagements using miniatures. Priestley and Halliwell, often called Hal, would cut their game design teeth on a couple of editions of Reaper, and though its rules were very different, the experience would be invaluable when the pair eventually sat down to work on the first edition of Warhammer a few years later. Reaper was helped to publication by Brian Ansell, the man who would go on to own Games Workshop and who was the driving force behind Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000. Tabletop Games and the Nottingham Model Soldier Shop published Reaper for Hal and Priestley after Brian Ansell made the connection between the young designers and TTG, and he would also link them up with artist Tony Ackland for the game's illustrations, with some additional art being provided by Tony Yates. Ansell himself spent time in 1980 releasing his own wargame rules, a sci-fi skirmish game called Laserburn. It wasn't a direct ancestor of what would become Warhammer, but it did influence Ansell's later work, and would go on to inform the development of perhaps the most important game that Games Workshop would ever make. But what am I even talking about? Reaper is not Warhammer, Laserburn is definitely not Warhammer, neither game was even by Games Workshop. Have I got skirmish madness? Well, no, because we're about to get to the start of the matter. By the early 80s, Brian Ansell was running Citadel Miniatures for Games Workshop, and he had it in mind to create a wargame that would let players use all of their awesome Citadel minis at the same time, and of course, provide an excuse for them to buy more. So he brought in Hal and Priestley, and together the 3 of them produced Warhammer, the mass combat fantasy role-playing game. The rules moved on a great deal from Reaper, but they kept some key aspects, and there was also a commitment to make role-playing an important part of the wargame experience, with continuity between battles for surviving combatants. Warhammer 1st Edition was released in 1983 as a boxed set. It featured cover art by John Blanche, the now famous Harry the Hammer Chaos Warrior, before Chaos Warriors were even a thing, and internal art was provided by fellow Reaper alumni Tony Ackland. Inside the box were 3 slim volumes: Tabletop Battle Rules, which detailed the core rules of play, a magic book, which included rules for wizards, spells, and enchanted objects, and a characters book, which let you field mighty heroes on your battlefields and gain experience over time. As the game was deeply entrenched in the emerging RPG mindset, it also required a 3rd participant. As well as the 2 opposing generals, it was designed with an umpire or games master in mind. They would be responsible for creating the scenario, managing special rules, and running any of the characters or monsters that might be found on the battlefield. The characters book even features what is essentially an RPG campaign, the Red Wake River Valley. The game was lambasted by critics for its frequent errors and typos, and the RPG components didn't really fit in that well. But the wargame rules received high praise, and more importantly, copies flew off the shelves. This game was a hit. Work quickly started on expanding Warhammer, with new miniatures being released to support it and the first real bits of lore and world building being included alongside them. Details were included on flyers, in magazine articles, and even on the back of boxes, basically wherever they could fit stuff. An initial expansion, Forces of Fantasy, provided fuller army lists for the Citadel miniatures range, and started to introduce a bit more story behind these various factions, going so far as to break down the forces of men, those of elves, the various goblinoid races, and even the new addition, the Army of Chaos. A book of battalions also introduced small lore nuggets and a few army lists for different races. But this was still far from the Warhammer world that we would come to know, populated as it was by red goblins, night elves, jabberwocks, and balrogs. But the genesis of it all had begun. Just about a year after its debut, Warhammer received a second edition in 1984, and it marked a clear step up in terms of production and polish. No longer looking quite so much like a set of rules typed up on the home typewriter, the second edition box feels more professional, filled out, and adorned with even more wonderful John Blanche and Tony Ackland art. Although still composed of 3 separate books, the structure of this edition has been altered a little. This time, the first book is called Combat, and whilst it still covers the core mechanics of the game, it now splits them into chapters on basic, advanced, and expert rules. Much of the wargaming remained the same, but the role-playing elements were stripped back considerably. The second book is again concerned with battle magic, including everything you need to field wizards, cast spells, and equip those magical weapons. The magic system was one of the standout aspects of the first edition, built around spellcasters spending through their constitution points in order to effect a spell, until they have no CP left and can therefore cast no more spells. The system remained largely unchanged for this second edition, though it did get expanded and the various laws of magic got codified in more detail. At this point, they are the magic's necromantic, demonic, illusionist, elementalist, and for all others, battle. The final book in the box is the Battle Bestiary, and this is where things start to get real Warhammery. The known world is introduced, comprised of the Old World, Araby, Norsca, Lustria, Cathay, the Darklands, and the Chaos Wastes. Though it would keep evolving through later editions, the Earth-inspired map of the known world establishes a lot of the fundamentals for the Warhammer setting, and begins the long-running tradition of fantasyifying real locations and history, for both good and ill. The Battle Bestiary also includes a timeline for the known world, and again it sets out key ideas that have survived to the very end times of Warhammer. The lore for many of the races included in the Bestiary is still pretty brief, but the general nature of each is already given shape. A shape that was, of course, liberally borrowed from the likes of Tolkien, Moorcock, Lovecraft, and Paul Anderson, amongst others. The set came with a scenario, the Magnificent Sven, which set the tone for skirmish scenarios that would be released for the second edition over the next couple of years. The Tragedy of Macbeth, Bloodbath at Orc's Rift, the Terror of the Lichmaster, all would add even more texture to the setting, including the latter introducing legendary villains and the first special characters in Warhammer, Krell, the chaos-worshipping undead warrior, and his Lich Master, Heinrich Kemmler. Second edition Warhammer also received its own equivalent of the Forces of Fantasy book, which established the armies for this new version of the Warhammer world. It was called Ravening Hordes. By the time of its publication in 1987, a uniquely Warhammerian race had made its debut in the pages of the spring 1986 Citadel Journal, the Skaven, and these foul ratmen would be included amongst the various hordes, alongside many of the classic Warhammer armies. Empire, Orcs and Goblins, the Undead, many of them were already present, though a few other armies from this book would soon fade into the background. We wouldn't see the regimented forces of Nippon, the Gnomes, or the Sea Elves for too much longer. Just like with first edition, this version of Warhammer was designed around letting players use as many of their Citadel miniatures as they wanted on the tabletop. But there was an increasing move at Citadel away from licensed and generic ranges, such as the D&D miniatures that they'd been producing for some time. Through the pages of the Citadel compendiums and journals, the Games Workshop magazine White Dwarf, and especially in the releases of unit boxes like the fabled Regiments of Renown, new characters and lore for the core Warhammer armies were regularly being added, with new elements of the background and geography of the known world being fused together. Whilst Ravening Hordes was being worked on, Games Workshop ensured that the original design of Warhammer having both a wargaming and an RPG element would be torn asunder forever. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, released in 1986, took all of the inchoate bits of lore, story, and world building that had been happening in flyers, magazines, and the back of miniatures boxes, and collated them into a more coherent and consistent setting. The locations and geography of the Warhammer world started to settle. The history and key players became better defined, and the feel of Warhammer took hold of a generation of gamers. The year 1987 would mark another major turning point for Games Workshop. In the space of that 1 year, a new edition of Warhammer would be released, the third edition of the game that refined and expanded on everything that had been done so far. But that wasn't all that hit the shelves. Rick Priestley's Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader would take all of the lessons learned from writing a fantasy battle game and apply them to a science fiction one. But who even knows what happened to that game in the end? Someone should do a documentary about that. For the first time, the third edition of Warhammer was not a boxed game. It was a chunky hardback book, and it focused heavily on troop movement, the use of heroes and war machines, and it started to put a finer emphasis on formalized army building and more balanced lists. Hallowell, Ansel, and Priestley are still credited on the cover for the design of this game, and inside they get an original design credit too. But Rick Priestley and Jim Bambara are the authors directly credited with writing this edition, although there's a separate credit for Bambara and Hallowell for developing the game ahead of release. The Warhammer Armies book took on the role that the Forces of Fantasy and Ravening Hordes had held before it. This was a comprehensive compendium of army lists for the core forces of the game. Those core forces stabilized with Warhammer 3rd edition and would largely remain the same for the next 5, with a couple of additions and subtractions here and there. There were also details for allied contingents and a bestiary of monsters included in the book, such as one of my perennial favourites, the Wolf Rat. In 1988, the first of 2 books about the forces of chaos would be released. The first was Realm of Chaos, Slaves to Darkness, which covered the Chaos gods Khorne and Slaanesh, their demonic hordes and their worshippers. The material was rich in background detail and supported an enormous range of Chaos options for use in both Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000. The second book, Realm of Chaos, The Lost and the Damned, did the same for Nurgle and Tzeentch and was released in 1990. Another supplement, Warhammer Siege, provided rules for use in both Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000. It had a bombardment of rules for fighting defensive battles and using mighty fortresses in-game. The 4th edition of Warhammer returned to the boxed set format, but that would largely be where the similarities with earlier editions ended. This box was a beast, and it, along with the Warhammer 40,000 2nd edition box, would be a turning point for Games Workshop. It was 1992 and a team of designers worked together to completely rewrite Warhammer for this edition. Joining Rick Priestley were Andy Chambers, Bill King, and Nigel Stillman. In the box, there was not just a rulebook, but a variety of templates and play aids. I particularly enjoyed the Fallen Giant, 2 infantry armies, high elves and goblins, cardstock representations of some mighty units like the Orc Rock Lobber, and some card buildings too. The cover art by Jeff Taylor depicts the epic clash of elves and goblins happening inside the box. This edition really marked the move to a more commercialized product for Warhammer. And instead of there being a Forces of Fantasy or Warhammer Armies book, a single volume that covered all of the potential army lists in the game, we would get the introduction of something that became a common occurrence for every future Warhammer edition, the Army Book. Each faction in the game received its own dedicated book, starting in 1993 with the Empire. The idea for these books was that they provided detailed history and lore behind the army, as well as bespoke rules, army lists, and perhaps most importantly, points values for each unit available. The 4th edition made balanced army lists a mandatory component of the game. and it introduced restrictions on the volume and types of choices that could be made whilst building an army. The magic system was also completely overhauled and released as a separate battle magic box. The powerful new spells included in it were ultimately toned down and reworked with a follow-up release called Arcane Magic that built on revisions that had been made via White Dwarf. Battle Magic actually included a template for the spell The Foot of Gork, and honestly I've just never gotten over how much fun that template is. During the reign of 4th edition, the Warhammer world would expand even further, or at least deeper, with the release in 1995 of Warhammer Quest. In game terms, this is possibly man's greatest adventure. Whoa! 4 years of mighty fine gaming had passed, and in 1996 it was time for Warhammer 5th edition, with sole writing credit going to Rick Priestley. Again, the format was a big box starter, this time featuring the return of some familiar Warhammer forces that had been notably absent throughout 4th edition. The Bretonnians and the Lizardmen would once again take the field. The cover art by Mark Gibbons brings these ancient foes back to life. The revised rules put more of an emphasis on the presence and capabilities of special characters and heroes in this edition over infantry and other types of unit, earning it the nickname Hero Hammer. An updated version of the Warhammer Siege expansion was released, as well as a new version of the Realm of Chaos, though this time it would be a box set that included dedicated Warhammer army lists, magic cards, and all kinds of chaotic tokens. Once again, there was a magic box set as well, and this was stuffed full of special cards, effects, templates, and tokens, and magic items. Or at least the cards for magic items. I don't think there was actually like a real Crown of Command in that box or anything. The 5th edition also saw the return of scenario boxed sets, something that hadn't been seen since around the late 80s. The Grudge of Drong, the Idol of Gork, the Circle of Blood, and others provided linked scenario campaigns, card buildings, army rosters, and background lore, with some new miniatures also being released to represent many of the key players in those stories. As well as continuing to release expansions for the 5th edition of Warhammer, Games Workshop also went back to its roots with historical gaming, and released something a little bit different around this time: Warhammer Ancient Battles. This system was designed to support historical wargaming, and was originally developed as a personal project by Jervis Johnson, Rick Priestley, and the Perry brothers Alan and Michael. The game was based on the core mechanics from Warhammer 5th edition, but systems like magic were totally removed and more emphasis was placed on unit organisation and manoeuvring. The Ancient Battles line would receive a number of dedicated books set in different historical eras, before the entire historicals range would be discontinued in 2012. There was also another flashback to the skirmish origins of the early Warhammer, with the release in 1999 of Mordheim. But to be honest, I haven't got more time to talk about that right now. At the turn of the millennium, more or less, the old ones demanded a new edition, and so 6th edition was created. Designed by Alessio Cavatore, Rick Priestley, Nigel Stillman, Jake Thornton, and chief designer Thomas Pirinen, the box set for this edition featured the classic pairing of Orcs versus the Empire, and included new top-of-the-line plastic units. After the previous edition's focus on heroes and monsters, 6th edition would seek to move things back towards infantry and bigger units. This edition also reworked the magic system for the game, doing away with the additional need for a separate box of magic cards and using more dice to represent the unpredictability of magic in the Warhammer world. Unlike for later editions, every major faction would receive an army book release for 6th edition, contributing to an overall sense of reasonable balance between forces. For many people, 6th edition is the definitive version of Warhammer. As well as functional expansions like the General's Compendium, annuals that collected up the vast amounts of wonderful White Dwarf support, and a skirmish rulebook, there would be a few lore-focused campaign books for this edition too. Not a new Warhammer edition, but definitely a new Warhammer scale. In the year 2000, Warmaster was released. This was designed to fill the same role for Warhammer that Epic filled for 40k, a 10mm wargame that enables huge battles in the Warhammer world. The 7th edition of Warhammer was released in 2007 with a new big box called the Battle for Skull Pass, which featured dwarves versus night goblins. Similar in many ways to the previous version of the game, 7th edition was designed by Alessio Cavatore, Graham Davey, Dominic Murray, Gavin Thorpe, and Jeremy Vettok. And whilst clarifications and refinements seemed to keep the game in reasonably good shape, army books were often said to suffer from some considerable power creep during this edition. Around this time, the old strategic board game Mighty Empires was retooled as a campaign system for use with Warhammer. But to be honest, there were not really many other expansions released during this era, and before long, a new and final edition of Warhammer would be inbound. The 8th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles was released in 2010. The team behind this mammoth tome was equally vast, with Alessio Cavatore, Robin Cruddas, Graham Davey, Andy Hoare, Jervis Johnson, Phil Kelly, Andrew Kenrick, Jeremy Vettock, and Matthew Ward all credited as designers. This thing is massive, and in its 500 pages there are a host of rules and lore and hobbying guides. Admittedly, it maybe has too many rules in it, but quite frankly, I love it. As with recent editions, alongside the release of the hardcover, there was also a boxed set, this time featuring High Elves vs Skaven on the Island of Blood. As well as all the standard army books, this edition would be expanded by campaign supplements, Blood in the Badlands and Sigmar's Blood, the magical and monstrous Storm of Magic, the multiplayer-focused Triumph and Treachery, and a couple of truly epic and beautiful Forge World books as well. The production on the 8th edition is magnificent. Every army book and every expansion looks gorgeous, and the Warhammer world was a vibrant and interesting place. Or at least I thought so, but sales just didn't support the line any longer. Unfortunately, things were in dire straits and a significant shakeup was required. Love it, hate it, or just admire it from afar without actually buying any products for it, the Warhammer world that we knew was about to come to a very abrupt close. In 2014, the End Times began, a series of linked campaign books that propelled the Warhammer story forward at a breakneck pace. Every major character and faction became involved in the unfolding plot, as Archaon the Everchosen led a major chaos incursion that threatened to, and ultimately did, consume the entire known world. There were loads of big and beefy miniatures released to support the 5 campaign packs. Each of those included 2 books, built around one of the major characters in the story: Glotkin, Kane, Nagash, Thanquol, and Archaon. And that was it. The Warhammer world was done. There would be no more editions of Warhammer Fantasy Battle. I was pretty sad, and to be honest, it took me a long time to warm up to the setting that would replace it. Age of Sigmar is a high fantasy, anything goes kind of place, and there are as many amazing ideas in it as there are ideas I'm not totally keen on. But to be fair, it has won me around, and there are some great stories to tell within that universe. But if you, like me, yearn for the old world that was, then I, like you, am in luck, because Games Workshop have announced Warhammer The Old World, a return to an earlier time period in the old Warhammer setting. Warhammer has played a major role in my life, and over the years it has taught me many valuable lessons. To be honest, I am pretty certain that I owe my literacy to background books and my numeracy to army lists, that my imagination was given flight by the Warhammer world and all of the weird wonders within it, that without the 8 editions of this marvelous game, I wouldn't be the person that I am today. So I say that we should all raise a stein of Bugmans to Brian, Hal, and Rick, and to every writer, designer, and artist who worked on every edition over these last 40 years. Cheers. I hope that you've enjoyed that reasonably quick history of the different editions of Warhammer. If you did, feel free to leave a like, to comment, or to subscribe to the channel. And if you want more history from the Warhammer world, then I will be releasing a different documentary each week for the rest of this month, looking at 2 editions of Warhammer at a time. The designers, the context of the release, and how the game has evolved will all be covered in those videos. I've also got a history of fighting fantasy coming out later in the month as well, and if you're looking forward to that, you might want to bring a pencil along too. I hope that you have enjoyed the channel so far. I have launched a Patreon to try and gain some more support, to try and grow the channel further, and if you're interested in that and have got the means and the inclination, feel free to jump over to Patreon following the link in the description below. Right now, I just want to say thank you very much for watching. I am Jordan, and this is Jordan's Sorcery. Honestly, this book is amazing. Amazing. though it really hurts your arm to keep it held like this. So, painful, but amazing. But painful. But amazing. But yeah, painful.